All right. Pretty sure I'm live now, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to Urbit Developer Week, everybody. Good to see you here. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about this week, which is going to be pretty exciting. I have some exciting news to share today that a lot of you probably already know. Hello, but I want to take a step back, talk a little bit about the past, what's led us to here, what we're so perhaps some new direction that we're about to take, and um, put a lot of the things we're going to talk about this week in context. And so over the last week, sorry, last week, over the last year, the Urbit Foundation has been really heavily focused on ecosystem growth, on driving more companies into the space, on promoting those, making it very clear that Urbit has moved beyond being, you know, a project with limited applicability to something that's now actually depended on by many different organizations taking it in many different directions that are all building real things. And I think over the course of this year, that's become really clear. And that ecosystem that we at the beginning of the year were really focused on supporting and uh, helping bring about is now extremely capable and is doing all kinds of great work. And they don't really need to be like highlighted anymore. I think that case is largely made. And so we've been, thinking about, okay, what does the Urbit Foundation do? What does it look like in that world in which our initial goal of helping bring an ecosystem about is now largely accomplished? And what we've settled on, and which is, probably not all that surprising to many people have been, expected us to do this for a long time, is to really take an active role in infrastructure development. With a capable ecosystem and people depending on Urbit, we have to make sure that Urbit is really dependable. And there are a lot of things that still need to be done about the system to finish it. I mean, ultimately, but to make it much more viable. And there's many different dimensions that we can engage in supporting to bring that about. And so, we're going to talk today about some of those areas. What we're going to kind of focus on. We think about them as communication and making sure that people know what's going on, how they can contribute, where the project actually is at, channeling developers into infrastructure development, and even engaging in that work directly ourselves. And so the exciting news is that we've brought Ted Blackman, Rav Nice Rickfer, on as our CTO, who's been working on Urbit for over 5 years now, I believe. Ted, do we have a Ted in the room?
Yes, we do. Hello.
Welcome, Ted.
Thank you.
So, urban infrastructure development, we've talked about for a long time. We've sort of imagined it as destined to become something that looks a lot more like other open source development projects. And right now it hasn't really looked like that. Tlon has driven Urbit from nothing to what we have today over its entire existence. And that culture of cathedral-like development of this company really fleshing out the core protocols that comprise Urbit into something that has a very specific point to it. It took a long time to get right, and so it really had to proceed in that way. But we now find ourselves in a world in which a lot of people actually want to contribute, and they're capable of doing so. Those ideas have really spread quite effectively, and we have a large body of people that really get Urbit and are capable of helping out. But we have the development proceeding via an organization. And we want to figure out how to make it spread out some more, or at least be possible for others to engage in that. And so pulling Ted into the Urbit Foundation is a way of being proactive about making sure that we can figure out how to develop Urbit across different organizations and outside of any one specific one. Like, this is a way of actually bringing that into being. Now we have to coordinate with Tlon, and we hope to serve as kind of the prototypical case of what it'll be like to work on this project. So, Ted, I'll kind of turn it over to you now. With that in mind, what are you excited about? What the heck are you going to be doing here?
Thanks. Yeah, and I agree with that. That is how I think of it, of what we're doing here. The first thing I'm excited about is the core dev roadmap that we just published earlier today, and so that's the result of the work of a few people, and there should be a link here in the video. So that's going to be a living document. We're going to keep it up to date, and so that's intended to be an entry point for if you want to understand what's going on with Urbit, especially what's going on with core development on Urbit, what stage that's at, what's being worked on now, what's coming up next. And ideally, if you're interested in contributing, that can be your first entry point where you look there and see, okay, well, here's a project that's coming up. Is there anybody working on that? Maybe I can work on it. So I'm excited about that. I think it's just about the right time for a lot of this stuff, right? I mean, as you said, I was at Tlon for over 5 years, and then just about a little over a year ago, we started to see all these other organizations start to pop up in the Urbit ecosystem, and now some of those, there are enough of those, and they're substantial enough, and there are enough developers who are outside of that. Or some of those are in those organizations. Some are just developers who've gone through Hoon School, learned how to write Hoon. Or have figured out on their own how to get involved, and so now it's there are enough independent groups and individuals involved in the ecosystem that it's a good time to start sort of developing in public more. And so for the past 5 years, we've been focused, on the core team, we've been focused on just getting stuff done. We need to continue to focus on that, but we also need to start scaling all of that stuff. So we need to ramp up the size of the teams. We need to start developing in public and sort of explaining ourselves more. And so that's going to be a big part of my job is to start, sort of raising awareness of what's going on with core to the broader Urbit ecosystem and to people who aren't in it yet, but could be.
Great. I'm curious about your take on what are the particular challenges to developing in public? Are they unique to Urbit? Are they shared across a lot of projects? How are we thinking about this?
I would say most of them are shared. I mean, Urbit does have a lot of its own vocabulary, but that's true of any large project, actually. So in this case, one thing that makes it a little bit more difficult is Urbit has, we have our own way of thinking about all of computing, right? And so that way of thinking is not standard. It's not agile development, right? It's not like our development practices are different. Philip wrote a good document called The Precepts about how do we think about Urbit development, right? But the version numbers go down, the code shrinks, right? All these things are sort of flipped on their head from how people normally write software. So some of that requires sort of an extra layer of training, right? Or documentation to explain to people how we think about it, right? And so that people do think about it differently. So that's a little bit harder, but in general, most of the problems are, I think, the same as any sort of substantial software project, where it's just, there are a lot of different components. It's important for people to learn not just, what the code is and how it works, but also why it was written that way. And what are the sort of important invariants that thing maintains, and why was it not written in other ways is also very important, right? So the sort of design, like the kind of design thinking that we do at Urbit, that's a little bit unusual, and so that's something that that makes it a little bit harder. But it's still, I think it's basically the same as most substantial projects.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to dig into that a little bit more, but I think we might circle back to it via another mechanism. I want to talk a little bit about where infrastructure development is at today. So Tlon, basically. What's going on at Tlon? What's been being worked on for perhaps this year? What's currently top of mind? where are core development efforts at today?
Yeah, so there's several different threads of work going on, and the roadmap gets into some of those. But I would say most of 2022 was focused on various forms of reliability. So a lot of bug fixing, some very complex bug fixing, like the Gull request queue fix. And then there are a bunch of fixes to aims for networking, Bane timers, fixes for staying up to date with the PKI. There are fixes on the runtime has a completely new system for maintaining memory safety, or as the heap and stack grow towards each other, and you have to make sure that they don't hit. So there's now a moving guard page in between those two. That's a novel system that had never been done before. That fixed a bunch of bugs. That plus some other fixes fixed a bunch of problems with the out of memory handling. Right. So just in general, there's a lot of effort put into making the system more reliable. And right now, there's actually a big backlog of projects that are either done or mostly done. And so we're focused now on getting those out the door and releasing those. So that's, but then some of those include, sometimes we talk about doing offense versus doing defense, right? So fixing bugs, these sorts of things, mostly doing defense. But some of these newer projects some of the projects that are in the backlog are actually offense, things like the remote scribe protocol, which is one of the first steps toward having Urbit be able to do scalable data distribution, content distribution. And so, that was written this year, and then that's in the pipeline to be deployed. Another piece of offense is a user space permissioning system that Pal van Vaslap is working on. And so that'll protect the kernel from applications, protect applications from other applications, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me like we've kind of been hamstrung on the ability to do either offense or defense, because doing releases is actually super difficult. And we have not only a pile up of the efforts that a lot of the core developers have been working on, but also things that contributors have been fixing in the background through grants or just unsolicited improvements to the kernel. And it's like, okay, this is all great, but we can't merge it because the release infrastructure is
right now there's a bottleneck on being able to release things quickly. Sorry, I had a hiccup there. Are we back?
Yeah, you're back.
But I think we were saying the same thing, which is that so right now, the thing we're focusing on most intently is increasing the speed of releases. And so this is in the roadmap also. That's the first item, is increasing the release frequencies. There are a number of concrete things that we can do to improve that. A lot of them have to do with tracking the versions of all the different parts of the system, different layers of the stack.
Yep. Yeah. Now I know one of the things that Tlon has been, really digging into throughout the year is their own release infrastructure. So there's the things that actually make doing releases viable, but then there's, even if they are viable, making sure that they work, because shipping things to a distributed network is generally just a hard problem. And I believe Tlon has set up a lot of processes, a lot of structures in order to make it possible to do releases, assuming, Urbit being capable of receiving them at all, without too much headache, but making sure that what gets released is definitely going to be of high quality. And they've been pretty focused on that throughout the year, right?
Yeah, that's one of the big improvements to process this year is what we call the dev stream process that Tlon has instituted. So instead of just pushing things out onto the network and hoping not too many ships break, which is how we did things for a long time. Instead, now we push things out to just a few canary ships within Tlon, and then all of Tlon, and then Tlon and friends. So Tlon plus people who are running big groups or are otherwise sort of on the bleeding edge of development. And then only once we've you run it at each of those stages for a few days, a few days of it working properly at each stage, and only then push it out to the network more widely. So that required a fair amount of tooling to set up, but it's been very helpful. It caught a lot of bugs in the Gull request QFix saga this summer.
Yep. Yeah, there's been a notable absence of releases that break everything this year, which has been nice. So I assume that's working.
Right. Yeah, that's right. You just want people to not to think about it, not to even notice, right?
Yeah. Totally. So that brings us, so I think it should be pretty clear now what Tlon's been doing and what's kind of going on right now. How do you imagine the Urbit Foundation's infrastructure development efforts being different from Tlon? Like, what areas are we going to carve out and work on that are distinct from what they're doing, and how will those be complementary?
Yeah.
That's
So
the goal.
the short answer is there isn't a hard and fast rule about it. Like, we need more hands on deck, and that's the first thing we're doing, just bringing more hands on deck. But one potential area that we could help with is Tlon is still managing the release process itself, which takes a lot of effort, and is of course crucial. But that some of the like longer term projects, things like that are a little bit closer to research, right? So those are a little bit tougher to sort of bring into that release process at Tlon. So we may have more of an opportunity to work on some of those things. We'll see. Tlon also does some of that work internally, and I think we also don't want it to be the case that sort of they do all the real work and we just produce a bunch of experiments that we foist on them, and then they have to try to deal with it, but they don't really work right. Like that's not where we want to be either. So we can't be sort of completely ivory tower separated either. So I think there's going to be a mix there. And then, so we'll see. Also, there may be some, Tlon also has, a number of like fairly large efforts that it has to maintain that are critical path. And so there may be some like smaller quality of life improvements that we can make to different pieces of the code. So I think some mix of making some really small quality of life improvements, and then also maybe some sort of longer term riskier projects that are more difficult to schedule into critical path. I think we'll have a little bit more of a focus on those, but we'll see. I think that's very much something to like continue to talk about and think through.
Yeah, this is an advantage that Tlon. I don't know if it's strictly an advantage, but a way that they've developed over the years has been to keep a product that's real, fun, front and center in order to drive prioritization of new work and ensure that there's, something in the here and now that long-term efforts are grounded in. You run the risk without something like that of being in an ivory tower and doing things that don't really connect with reality, working on the wrong thing perhaps. And so, that's a challenge we're going to have to come up with our own approach to. I think it'll probably look a little different than theirs because we're not really aspiring to be a product company, aside from Urbit being the product. But we'll have to make sure that we come up with our own answer to that, I think.
Yeah, and I think also we at the UF we spend a lot of time talking to everybody else in the ecosystem, not just Tlon, but all these other companies and all these other people, and so it'll be a little bit easier for us to have sort of our finger on the pulse there about some other products that need support from core, and what kind of support they need from core, and sort of championing external contributors who making contributions to the kernel and the runtime, that sort of thing, where I think it's just a little bit easier for us to kind of do some of that stuff. But I also, we're still in very close communication with Tlon. It's a very there's not like a particularly clear boundary there, I would say. I mean, well, in terms of organizations, there is, but in terms of the what the work, what the work is that needs to get done, that's very much shared, I would say.
That makes sense. So looking into the future a little bit, like if the Urbit Foundation is successful in what it's seeking to do, in what ways will Urbit look different a year from now, both technically and socially?
1 year from now? It's a good question.
We can speculate about further in the future as well.
Yeah, I think
like
it's
that
easier
jumps to mind as well. Yeah.
I think 2 years from now is an easier sort of milestone. 2 years from now, I would say, if we do our jobs right, then I think we'll be able to make some reasonable claims about security, right? To say at least certain parts of the system, you can rely on certain dimensions of security. Things like, okay, we'll be able to withstand, denial of service attacks that are done by somebody on a weekend, that sort of thing. Or we've gone through the deserialization function called Q, right? And we've trawled through that in great detail, and we feel confident to say that doesn't have any vulnerabilities, right? That sort of thing. So we won't be able to say this thing is 100% secure in every possible way, but we'll be able to credibly make claims that it can be relied. Certain security properties can be relied on by 2 years from now. Important ones, big ones. So I'd say that's one of the big differences between now and then. Other ones are that right now there's a big bottleneck on being able to store data inside of your Urbit. You can only store, we just bumped up from 2 gigabytes to 4 gigabytes, and now there's a PR to bring that up to 8. And the roadmap goes through how we'll get to 16 and then potentially 16 gigabytes, and also how to store large files in addition to that, basically. Large atoms is what it's called technically. But so there's an intermediate step there between 16 gigabytes and a full 64-bit interpreter. A 64-bit interpreter, when it has all of the other tooling that you need for managing the large amounts of data, can manage sort of effectively unlimited amount of data. But we may not get there over the next couple of years, but we will get to people being able to use Urbit for multimedia applications where you're actually storing those files inside of your Urbit. You don't have to bolt on some sort of like external S3 connector or something like that. You'll be able to store your Shrek 2 inside of your Urbit. So that enables all kinds of things like file sharing, podcasting, right? So there's a common critique like, oh, Urbit's just a chat app. It's like, well, yeah, for now, but partly that's because you can't really build some of these other kinds of apps yet. So that'll expand the kinds of use cases that Urbit satisfies. And then
there are many examples of this, like certain milestones across security open up different possibilities in, say the crypto space.
Yeah.
And
right.
Like there's many places where, some specific milestone actually unlocks a whole series of new use cases for the system.
Yeah, very much so. And in particular, 2 years from now, I see us, we'll see, that's a little aggressive, but I think 2 years from now being over the hump in the sense that, almost everything that you want to build with Urbit, the core supports it, right? And the core is no longer, the main limiting factor preventing some application from getting adoption, right? There will be other blockers to adoption, but getting the core mostly out of the way by a couple of years from now that's what we want to do. It's an aggressive goal, but because we're ramping up these teams, we're ramping up the processes, and we can see the end now, right? We can see around the corner, see the light at the end of the tunnel. We started seeing that about 6 months ago. Philip wrote a memo internally that was just published on Talon's site that I highly recommend reading. And
you can find that in their public group, I believe.
Yeah. And and one of the points that Philip makes that I think is really an excellent point is that for the first time we can really see what remains to be done. Like we really know what needs to happen between here and where we want to be. And for a long time, for the whole previous history of the project, a lot of those things were so far off that we couldn't even really think about them directly. There were intermediate milestones that had to be accomplished first. So now we're actually close enough that we can see it. And so we can start enumerating things that, like what's on the roadmap, right? Here's what needs to happen to get us there. And that is now a concrete, enumerable set. It's not 100% nailed down, right? There's still some question marks, but yeah, so that's the general story. And then there are a couple other dimensions to what that looks like, right? What are the other bottlenecks? It's things like, one of the big ones is zero-click maintenance, right? One of the promises of Urbit is that you have this thing, it's a computer, and you can maintain it very easily, right? So it essentially maintains itself. If you do need to do some sort of task, like, cleaning out some old files or something, that's easy to do. You can do it manually, and you don't have to be an expert in order to do it. I think it was Galen who came up with the idea of it should be like bicycle maintenance, right? It's like, you can take care of your bicycle, or you can take it to a shop and have it fixed up, but it's pretty easy to take care of. It's not a nuclear reactor, right? For most people, most software, trying to maintain that yourself is like a nuclear reactor, right? It's like this stuff is impenetrable, inscrutable. And so your Urbit really shouldn't be that way. There's enough technical simplicity at different layers of the stack for that to be the case. But it does require some more attention to tooling, attention to reliability, and a few other things to get it to the point where it can just sort of keep running forever. And one of those is also backward compatibility. So getting to the point where we can commit, I think it's very important for us to get within, at least within a few years, ideally within a couple of years, get to the point where a developer can write an app, publish it on Urbit, and reasonably expect that to run forever, right? Even though the kernel continues to update after that, that backward compatibility will be maintained. So this is an important feature of operating systems in general. It's one that we can't do right now because we need to change a few more things, right? So making those changes, getting them done to the point where we can get to something where we can say, okay, this thing isn't perfect, but it's good enough that we're willing to maintain it. That's a good goal for us. And that requires changing a number of things in the interface between applications and the kernel so that we can say, okay, now this interface is good enough to stabilize, good enough to commit to. And in particular, there's some pieces of security and scalability that are missing from that. And so those are in the roadmap to be done over the next couple of years. Once we get over that hump, then I think developer experience is the thing to really crank on, right? Saying, changing the ergonomics of the API so that it's more convenient for developers and cleaner, that sort of thing. But some of that work will probably happen a little bit later, and then getting the major components right and getting the sort of overall shape of the system correct needs to take priority for now.
In many cases, getting developer ergonomics right requires developers to use existing APIs in order to figure out what is ergonomically bad about them. Because the impression I have is a lot of times it's like, what's built seems like a good idea. I mean, otherwise, why would you do it? And then people use it for a year and they go, this kind of sucks. Can we make it better? And I think subscriptions are a really good example of that. And that's why those are being reworked.
That's right. Yeah, we've had all kinds of problems with Urbit's subscription system. The kernel's had a lot of problems with it. The user space developers have had a lot of problems with it. It's difficult to use that system in such a way that establishes correctness. And then it's even more difficult to use it in a way that guarantees both correctness and reasonable performance. And so, that needs to be the default, right? It needs to be easier to write an application correctly than incorrectly. And then also it needs to be the case that if you write an application in a somewhat naive manner, it should still have reasonable performance properties, right? And then getting it to have excellent performance properties may require some manual tuning from the developer. That's fine. But a subscription system, and there's a whole plan for a new subscription system called subscription reform involving solid state publications, what we're calling them, and those tie into Urbit's immutable Scry namespace, right? So it's a very different way of thinking about subscription that's much more based on the idea of synchronizing state from the publisher down to the subscriber. But that's also much more explicit about basically memory management, because one of the big problems with subscriptions is memory pressure in practice. And that's something that we only learned from using and upgrading subscriptions for years, right? So that came, the understanding that this system needed to be better very much came from the experience of using the existing APIs and saying, okay, there's this problem, there's this other problem, right? Resubscription is tough. You get memory pressure. It's hard to manage the interaction with the AIMS networking, right? To do that just right, to make sure that you don't cause performance issues or resource utilization issues. So yeah, and then also on the kernel side of all these bugs that we experienced in the kernel that were basically downstream of trying to implement something that was a bit too complex. So we need something that's simpler and more solid state like the rest of Urbit. And so some of those designs still need some work, right? We're still thinking through a lot of the pieces there. So there's still some technical risk involved in executing that properly. But we're starting that work now. And actually that's, the UF is starting work on the prototypes for solid state publications. So Wickrun is leading that project.
Yeah, that's great. And that maybe takes us into a discussion of some of the things that the UF is going to specifically do around funding core development work. We are going to identify people to build a bigger team under you to tackle some of these projects on the roadmap. We've talked a good amount about grants and how we're thinking about those going forward. I think historically we've funded a lot of applications to be developed, right? Coming out of software or distribution being released a year ago, going, okay, let's, really throw some things at the wall and see how well this thing works. And it's gone pretty well. And I think there's a bit of a virtuous cycle between developers using things, building, uncovering certain shortcomings in those systems, and then, fixing those based on experience. What do you think will change about grants going forward? Like we've talked a bit about putting more of an emphasis on infrastructure work. Like how do we do that?
Yeah, and I'm coming into the grants program pretty fresh here. Like that, it's not something that I'd been involved with previously, and so I think it's been interesting for me to see as I start learning about it, to see some of the pretty impressive statistics about how well it's been working. So I think one of the most important things is to make sure that it continues working because it has been, and so a lot of the new developers in Urbit went through a grants program. A lot of the new hires in Urbit went through the grants program. Substantial percentages of both. And it seems that it's a nice sort of gentle on-ramp into just before working on Urbit full time, right? So it's a way for people who still have a normal job and a normal life to sort of dip their feet into Urbit development in a way that they get remunerated for, at least somewhat. But they can do that on the side, right? Maybe on weekends or after work hours, something like that. It's a relatively low commitment, and they can try it, and then often they get hooked. And so then once they get hooked, then when they complete the grant, then they also have a proof that they can go take to Urbit companies and say, look, I actually do know how to write Hoon. I actually do understand this system. And so it makes them much more hireable. So that's a really nice pipeline to have. And I would say the first thing is making sure that we make sure that pipeline continues to work well. And I think then we do want to sort of target core a bit more, right? And so sort of across the board at UF. And so what that looks like for grants is doing more grants for core dev, and focusing the grants program more on development in general. as opposed to a few other kinds of grants that were a fair number of cultural grants and things for grants for encouraging adoption of the network, basically. And so as UF is shifting more toward development, the grants program will make a similar shift. And the other thing is that it's likely that as we shift more toward core dev, then we'll also end up with a smaller number of individual projects, but then each project is likely to be a bit larger. So there's going to be that sort of shift as part of it as well. And that's mostly how I see the differences going.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much right. And the big benefit we have to doing this kind of work now is, well, kind of having you on board. It's a big one. Like the hard part about doing core development work is knowing exactly how to communicate the work that needs to be done. So, we need good specs, and getting better about writing more specs for all those different items in the roadmap. Like, it'd be really great if at some point every single, this is a lofty goal, but if every single thing on that roadmap has a well fleshed out spec, which is often, very time consuming. It can take a year or so to really produce a good specification for some of these projects after doing all the requisite research and evaluating different approaches and context of the larger system. Like, that takes a lot of work, but it's very important.
It does take work, but it is extremely important and increasingly important as we develop in public more. So that's one of the things I really want to focus on at UF is writing specs and encouraging and helping other people to write specs for what they're working on. So yeah, and a good example of this is all that subscription stuff that I was just talking about. There isn't a spec yet for solid state publications because we don't know exactly how it's going to work. All right, so getting to the point where we actually could specify it is one of the first steps in that project. Because once you can specify it, then you can look at it, right? And lots of people can look at it and say, hey, this spec actually has a flaw, right? If somebody looks at it carefully. If you spec something well enough, then, either
figure those out before you build them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. And so that's one of the main ways of decreasing the risk in some of these difficult projects is figuring out, well, all right, well, what are we going to build? And often once you have the spec, then you go to build it and you run into some problem that you hadn't thought of anyway. And you end up adjusting the spec, writing a new one. But it's like, there's that old saying, from the military that no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
But there's an addendum to that some other general said. It's like, but having a plan is essential. And the same goes for writing software, right? You can't necessarily stick to the spec exactly as it was written initially, because maybe you missed something or maybe there's a better way to do it. But having that as a starting point is really useful. And then often what happens is you adjust some piece of it, but you keep the invariance, right? Because you define a good spec will describe what the invariants are that the system will maintain. And so often there are different implementations that keep the same invariance. And so you might, in the course of building one implementation, say, this other implementation would be better, but you at least have the same invariant, so you know that you're switching. Or if you decide that you need to change an invariant, right, add a new one or relax one, then you go and adjust the spec, and you do that as that's actually the sort of the operation that you're performing there is adjusting the spec and then adjusting the implementation to match it. But thinking of it in terms of the spec is how you ensure that the thing actually works. And it's also how you ensure that you can describe the system to someone else, right? So that someone else can take it over and work on it. Because just looking at a piece of code, if you have to reverse engineer the invariants that are maintained, or why it was designed that way, or what the state transitions are, that takes a lot of time. You can mess it up, right? And so if there's also a specification for what this thing is doing, right, or why, what are the high level,
provide all that surrounding context for why the choices that were made. When you look at a piece of code, you only see the choices that are made. You don't see the reasons that other ones weren't made in their place. And so,
exactly,
this is a failure mode of looking at a piece of code and going, oh, why is it done this way? We should do it this way instead. Which it's like, oh, by the way, there was that approach was known and was not chosen for these reasons. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think, yeah, I think of that as one of the most important things that we can do for scaling up the team, right? And for core dev, right? Is make sure that actually these projects do have specs. Because yeah, then if everyone who's interested in core dev reads those specs, right, then they know a fair amount about what's going on, how the system is working, and then they're in a much better position to come in and implement one of those specs, or come up with a new proposal for something that they want to work on, right, or identifying how different flaws in the system could be addressed. So I think it's one of the most important communication tools that we have.
Yeah. Yep. So I want to make sure we reserve some time for questions. If you have any questions, start throwing them into the chat and we'll call them out as we see them. In the meantime, while I wait for the lag time on, the delivery of that message and for people to type the questions out, I want to address Tiller Tolbus here. We are going to keep some budget for things that we don't quite know how valuable they will be. Olaf, so what's being referenced here, is super cool. And I would like to make sure that things like that continue to get funded. What we're more looking at doing is making sure that we have pretty concrete budgets set aside for different kinds of work. And operationally, we think about this as well. We want most of our work, our funding to be directed towards core. We want a good amount of it to still be directed towards app development because this is proven to be and we have the numbers to show it, a really effective way at getting new people into core development. Like many of our current core developers started as being app developers. So we know that this is an effective pathway. And we'll probably also reserve some budget. It'll be small and probably competitive, but that's fine. We had a total of 7 proposals out of close to 100 this last year that were in the not technical camp. So it's not like this is there's not perfumes all over the place. And so when we see these, it's not that we can't, it's not that we can't spare a few stars. But I think we have some questions now. So to call out the first one here, what qualities do you look for in Urbit developers? Ted, this is probably a good one for you.
Yeah. It's really, let's see. Okay, so there are a few different things. Of course, there's a baseline level of competence in writing code. But I would say that it's very important for people who want to work on core to understand understand the design ethos, something like that. The ethos, the architecture, the aesthetic of Urbit, because it is different from other systems. And so, like any system where you don't really want to fight the way it does things. You don't want to go against the grain, right? So you want to sort of be writing something in a way that is in accordance with the sort of principles that the rest of the code uses. So in Urbit, that's things like being very wary of abstractions and only building abstractions that are known to be that you can essentially prove are watertight and really don't leak, right? So that's not 100% how we do things, but we're much more that way than almost anywhere else, right? Like Urbit is purely functional, which means that when we say that, we really mean like in Knock, all you ever do is run a functional expression, right? There is no IO monad like in Haskell, right? There's no like that does not leak, right? There is no it's a airtight abstraction, and so the
just a quick
that
sidebar,
kind of rigidity,
those qualities are really well summarized in those precepts that we talked about before. We're going to link those in here. If you haven't read them, read them. There they are. Sorry, continue, Ted.
Good. Yeah. Good point. But I would say that that sort of rigidity, right? That sort of, there's an uncompromising quality to the structure of the system when working on the core, we really want uncompromising people who are willing to say, no, I'm not going to add an exception in this API, right? I'm not going to have a sort of escape hatch for something. Yeah, because Urbit as a system sort of doubles down on these very rigid rules for itself. And that's how it keeps itself clean, and it's how it keeps itself it sort of maintains both the beauty and also the functionality of the system. Because if you violate any of those, then you can lose a lot of guarantees, and those guarantees are how the simplicity is maintained. And so if you lose the guarantees, you lose the simplicity. If you lose the simplicity, you lose the quality in general. So I think, yeah, we're looking for people who can write code. You have to have some amount of openness, I would say, if you've been doing other programming. You have to be willing to sort of learn a new modality. So you need some openness, and then yeah, an ability to to be uncompromising.
Cool. Great answers. Let's get on to the next question. This one I think is a little bit tongue in cheek. Your thoughts on team title?
I plead the fifth. No, I said my piece on that in the GitHub comments, and yeah, it's a small issue, and however we resolve it, we just need to kind of get it done and move on.
A sidebar on that issue that doesn't have to do with the issue itself. That is something I've always appreciated about the Urbit repo, is the wealth of information about the way that people think that you can find in looking at the comments on PRs. The Urbit repository is, in my experience, I know it for having like some really heavy heated discussions in pull requests that are very informative and very readable. You can learn a lot, and I learn a lot by regularly just perusing issues and pull requests, especially the ones that have a lot of comments. Like you can get a very good sense of how people think.
That is a lot of how I learned about Urbit back in 2016, 2017.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like, it's where the conversation happens, and any work that we do about communicating is going to be kind of filling in the gaps between a lot of those threads and supplying some glue between them, because they're a great resource.
Yeah, well, I would say a lot of the development does happen there, right? A lot of the discussion about development does happen on GitHub, but then these days, quite a bit of it also happens on Urbit itself. And so in the Forge group in particular, mid-dev, the Forge, and there's a new core channel there that I encourage people to take a look at, where we've been talking about core development. And so a lot of the public to the network discussions about core are now happening in the core channel in the Forge. So it'd be nice to link that too. And because it's a relatively new channel, but it's been pretty active. And that's a public channel.
Yeah, you'll find more in the new, I think it was put up on the screen earlier, but the new Urbit Foundation public group, which will have, less of the thoughts in progress and, real-time decision-making happening, and more of the, more long-form updates about what's happening on kind of a consistent basis, monthly minimum, or probably more frequent. We have a question here about native UI and mobile UI. This is the conversation I know I've had with various people quite a bit. It's a tough one. I think we all feel the pain of having to write JavaScript. It's hard to imagine something that's more of a polar opposite ethos-wise than Urbit, than the JavaScript ecosystem. And kind of being wedded to that when we deal with front ends is tough. I know some Urbit developers that have learned Urbit first and have then gone and learned JavaScript have been, quite unhappy, to understate it, about what they experienced there. And it really kind of underscores the benefit of simplicity in a system, that is contrasted with how, learning learning, 8 years of React, what it's like to, figure out how to dip into that ecosystem. Um, the problem is a pragmatic one, which is that UIs, like the way I see this, like redesigning UIs is probably, or user interface, and thinking about that problem as a whole is of comparable challenge to just building Urbit in general. Figuring out servers, like user interfaces are really, really complex. And there's a lot of prior art that goes into those. And at least at this time, with the resources we have, I know there's a lot of talks, and Ted, you can maybe speak more to this about doing research in this space. But for the time being, we're probably going to be stuck with web UIs for a while because they're all bad. They all, like every UI framework is hated on by some contingent of people that use it pretty heavily. And the web happens to be the one that works in the most places and lets us get the most bang for the buck. And so that, continues to be dominant out of a choice of pragmatism. I don't know.
This is true, but I actually don't. I think 2 years from now, we'll at least have a native UI system, Urbit native UI system that is usable for some applications. So that's how I see this going. And it may not look very similar to the sort of long-term version of a Urbit native UI system, because it is a very difficult problem. But I've been talking to Hasduck Dibtux about this quite a bit over the past year, and there's a lot of motivation to fix this. So yeah, I think that the important thing is that it is a long-term research project, and so I would say that the most important thing there is making sure that we can come up with something that we can at least start trying, right? And it might look pretty different. As I was saying, it might look pretty different from what it eventually looks like, but at least it would be something where you could basically stay in the Urbit mindset and build at least certain kinds of user interfaces. And then, so I think that there are different kinds of incrementalism with research, and in this case, I think we actually want incrementalism for the use cases. So start with a limited set of use cases, and then broaden it out to having sort of more of the user interface components on the screen, let's say, built using an Urbit native UI, right? And then there are only a few pieces that need to use some sort of specific UI component that's specific to React or to iOS. And that way, if you're getting started with Hoon and you don't know any other languages, then you can learn Hoon and then learn a little domain specific language for the user interface, or maybe it's just a data structure, or maybe it's maybe it actually is just Hoon. Like there are different ways of approaching the problem, but whatever it is, you should be able to keep the Urbit way of thinking in UIs, which means things like concrete data, data orientation, separation of code and data, static types wherever possible, and a certain amount of minimalism, and just general sanity. The bar for sanity in Urbit is a lot higher than in other systems. And so there are, I think, lots of different things that could be built that would satisfy all of those, at least for a subset of user interfaces that people like to build. And that way you want to learn Urbit, that's your first language, your first system that you're working with, and you don't want to go have to learn some second system. You should be able to do that. And yeah, maybe then there's a slider on the page that you can't do with a Urbit UI. And so you have a friend of yours help you, add a little JavaScript specific slider thing that's outside of the UI system, right? Something like that. So, because that way we can at least make incremental progress toward having a UI system for everything, and sort of encompass more and more of what people want to do inside of Urbit. There's already some of this actually. So the PalDev app suite, the vast majority of it, my understanding, doesn't use any JavaScript at all. And it uses Sail, which is a DSL for XML data in Hoon. And so you can actually stay in Hoon and write certain kinds of web applications, as long as they're just sort of Web 1 applications. Basically, they're submitting forms and aren't doing Ajax. So that's my answer there. Is hopefully by 2 years from now, you won't be completely stuck building web UIs, but you'll be partially stuck.
right, that's good. We have, okay, this is probably a quick question from Jack Fox. Is the 4 gig Loon in Zeus 418? I think you meant 417. Is that right, Ted?
That doesn't correspond to a Kelvin version, as far as I know.
Yeah, because that's a runtime update, right? So it actually, but there was a,
yeah. So knock, right? So the Kelvin versions apply to the kernel, right? Which are all written in Hoon, right? So which are basically other than knock itself. So knock is at Kelvin 4, and then there's a Kelvin version for Arvo, the kernel, like the kernel proper, Kelvin version for lull, which describes the interfaces to the vanes, and then a Kelvin version for Zeus, which is the standard library that user space applications get to use. So that top one is either 418 or 417 right now, and that's referring to Zeus. But all of those, all the way down to the Hoon version, which is 140, those just refer to pieces of code that are written in Hoon, right? That could compile down to knock. So whether the amount of there's nothing in knock about how big the loom can be, like how much data, like how large that tree can be. Knock doesn't know about that. It doesn't care about it. That's a property of a runtime. And so you can just build a different runtime to run any Kelvin and have more or less data storage available to it.
Yeah. Because we're running out of time, moving on real quick, we have 2 questions in the same vein about the balance of priorities between full-time hires, part-time hires, grants, contract-based. Jack asked a similar question down below. Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit. Ted, you can chime in as well.
Yeah.
The answer is both. Like, we are looking to hire core devs on a full-time basis. We have a hiring budget we've set out throughout the year to add a few more hires. We are going to be approaching many of those grants first, the way we've approached most hires in the past that has turned out to be pretty successful, by creating grants that capture the kind of work we would want to find in someone. We would interview them as though it was a job interview, get them working on the project, and then work with them for a while. And if it turns out that that relationship is really great on both sides, well, then that's a really good way of driving towards our answer of, should we work together on a full-time basis? Like one thing underscoring our hiring strategy for the next year is to look for domain experts in areas that we know that we need help in. Ted, you can comment on this more specifically, but we really need a security person, and we really need a networking person. We need people that actually have some prior experience, not just in Hoon and writing the particular flavor of problems that we have, but that understand some of these more fundamental problems in a way that we already don't, and can bring a certain amount of expertise to Urbit that it needs and is missing right now.
Yeah, that's right. And so I would say expect some job postings relatively soon. We are looking to hire some more core developers, so that's both kernel and runtime. And the ideal core developer can work on either side, right? Work in C or work in Hoon, and ideally be able to do projects that involve both C and Hoon. Especially a lot of these networking projects involve writing some of both, and so that's a little bit more difficult to do. You really have to kind of understand Urbit as a whole in order to work on both sides simultaneously. But that's really what we're looking for.
Yeah. Let's see. Anything else here? I think that's actually, we have one final question. I think we can get through all of them. Vinny asks, any thoughts you can share on stepping towards shared state between agents, or is remote scry the planned path for that?
So solid state subscriptions are the planned path for that. And so the way that will work is that Gall will actually maintain the data for some publication at a particular path. So Gall will have a mapping from subscription path to the state of that publication, which will have the current state, and then also potentially a list of diffs that were used to arrive at that state, and then also a revision numbers on all of those saying what revision they were in the scry namespace, so that they can be retrieved through remote scry or through local scry. But in terms of sharing data among applications, if those two applications are on the same ship, then Gall should just be maintaining this one copy of the publication data. And then whenever, if you have two different agents, let's say one's publishing it and another's subscribing to it, they're on the same ship. Whenever any of those agents is activated, Gall will copy that data into the subject of the agent so that you have it available to read from, ideally as a statically typed, easily accessible datum. And then so you can use it in your app very directly, sort of synchronously. You don't have to request it, wait for the response to come back. And you shouldn't have to do type conversions to use it. So getting to that, there are a few things listed in the roadmap about this. So there's basic solid state publications, and then a typed interface to solid state publications. Typed paths, which are done, are implicated in this as well. And if you want to look at the section on ZapGal security, that also relates to this question. But basically, the short answer is Gall will maintain one copy of this, and then it'll copy that into applications that care about it. But the state, because the state is being managed outside of the application, the kernel doesn't need to duplicate it. And also, when it copies, that's using structural sharing. So in the runtime, that's just copying a pointer. It doesn't duplicate the memories.
Great. So we are at time. I want to remind everybody, I believe later today, there's a conversation about the roadmap specifically with Philip. Is that right?
No, Thursday. That's on Thursday. Right. That's on Thursday.
Okay, I'm wrong. Thursday, there's a conversation. Definitely go into that. Check it out. They'll get further into the weeds about some of these things. And then later this week as well, on Friday, there's going to be a conversation with a bunch of different companies that are looking to hire about how to go and get jobs at various places. If you're looking to, start working on Urbit all the time, then you want to show up for that. I think that's about it. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is great. All right, well, enjoy Developer Week, Ted. Good to see you. Everybody, good to see you. We'll talk soon.